The past few years have seen an uptick in partnerships between satellite and telcos as mobile operators look to expand the reach of their networks. Direct-to-device has driven many of the headlines in this area, but the satellite-telco convergence also encompasses satellite broadband, backhaul, and IoT. This week, we hear from Tim Hatt, Head of Research and Consulting for GSMA Intelligence, about the mobile industry's perspective on the satellite-telco convergence. GSMA Intelligence provides forecasts and research for the mobile ecosystem. Mobile operators are closely watching the rollout of satellite constellations, and GSMA Intelligence is now tracking more than 100 partnerships between mobile operators and satellite companies. In our conversation, Tim talks about how mobile operators see working with satellite as a differentiator, digs into some of the issues at play as direct-to-device begins to commercialize, and why we shouldn't overlook the potential of standards-based satellite IoT. I'm Rachel Jewett, and you're listening to On Orbit, the podcast that asks, what's our future in space? Hi, Tim. Welcome to On Orbit. How are you doing today?
Great. I'm doing really well, and good to meet you, Rachel. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks. So for some of our audiences, a lot of our audience is in the satellite industry, and I know some are familiar with GSMA, but can you tell me a little bit about what GSMA does and your role as head of research for the organization?
So the GSMA is the trade association for the telecom operators worldwide. I actually work in the GSMA Intelligence team, which is the analyst arm of the organization. And we have a remit to cover the telecom industry and increasingly tech and other verticals as well globally. So that covers like a whole range of topics, as you'd imagine, but the whole movement to partner with a lot of the satellite organizations and that satellite connectivity has become a big part within that. So we've been looking at this topic for a few years now, and yeah, we're excited to talk about it.
Great. And yeah, I know on the satellite side, it's seen as an area of big opportunity. And so it's cool to hear from the mobile operator side more on this issue.
Definitely. As you can imagine, and we'll probably get into in the discussion, like the operators are seeing this as a real, good way to extend, their own networks. And I think that brings a whole lot of interesting technological implications, as well as sort of kind of revenue and monetization implications that the wider ecosystem will be interested in. So yeah, a lot of interest.
Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of kick us off, how do you define the issue of satellite and mobile integration? So I know that direct-to-device gets a lot of headlines and attention, but what is kind of the scope of technologies and services that are under this umbrella of the satellite and mobile integration?
Yeah, so it's a good scene setter. So as much as you say kind of direct to device or direct to cell, as some people call it, is behind a lot of the market momentum of the last 18 months. The satellite industry, of course, has been in existence for decades. And so that includes satellite connectivity for like maritime applications and other kind of IoT-based applications like trucking and logistics. It includes satellite broadband. So that's where you're serving an internet connection at somebody's home or premises, like a school or a hospital, perhaps in a rural area. And that includes mobile satellite. And even within that last category, yes, there is the direct-to-device, but there's a long-standing utilization of satellite for backhaul connectivity, which basically means the connectivity to get from the user to the core part of the network and ultimately the internet. So there's a lot of different, as you say, different service categories within the overall satellite banner that's important to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And how would you say that the relationships between satellite industry and mobile industry and integration has accelerated in the past few years?
Well, I think the main acceleration catalyst, like the thing that was there and that has sped up the integration, is that NTN standards were enshrined within the 3GPP standards. And those are essentially, for people in the podcast who may or may not know, the standards that set sort of mobile telephony worldwide. And what that did was it sort of made it so that there would be a common set of technical standards people follow. And that makes it a lot cheaper to bring products to market and makes it quicker. And so the mobile operators are very interested in this, as well as other companies in the device world and chipset world, because it means that whereas in the past, you had to integrate with individual satellite companies on a one-on-one basis. So it's kind of a proprietary approach. Tends to be a bit costly, a bit inefficient, more time consuming. Whereas now you can work on the basis of a common standard and know that that will apply across a much larger range of devices that people like you and I are own and will be able to tap into connectivity that is enabled by NTN as well as linked to your normal terrestrial service that we've become accustomed to over time.
Yeah. So are you seeing a greater interest on mobile network operators to partner with satellite operators because of these standards?
There has been, yeah, and I think the momentum we've seen is that now you get to a point where um, you have over 100 partnerships we track
Yeah.
between operators and satellite companies, and that translates into about 70% of global market share in terms of mobile subscribers. So there is a lot of interest. The other, though, point to raise is that besides the standards,
Yeah.
and the cost efficiencies that flow from that, I think there's an increasing realization that there's both a consumer monetization and an IoT monetization opportunity here through satellite. And that's really, I think, behind a lot of the interest as to why, operators are partnering with satellite companies now to set themselves up for the next, let's say, 3, 4, or 5 years.
Yeah. And then, for if we have some readers that or listeners that might not understand, you talk about like why satellite is of interest and like why can't the mobile network operators cover everything themselves? Like why would they even need to work with a satellite operator?
So mobile networks extend very far. They cover 3G coverage or higher is about 90% of the global population. Um, Reaching that final 5 to 10%, though, is the most challenging because of the economics and some of the geographic constraints. So it's very hard when you're talking about reaching, let's say, far-flung islands or mountainous regions to do that with terrestrial connectivity alone. Even if you're using something called network sharing, which is sort of lowers the cost of rolling out your network to those rural areas. Um, with satellite, that creates a much more cost efficient way if you can integrate it with a terrestrial network. And with direct to device, that matters because it then provides a signal direct to somebody's handset rather than requiring them to buy a satellite receiving dish that people probably know. You see them stuck up on the side of houses or buildings to receive the signal. And so it's lower cost, it's quicker, and just brings a lot more people into play.
Yeah. In your previous answer, you mentioned the like two different modes of the IoT versus the consumer monetization. Can you talk about how you see how those are different?
So when we talk about consumers, we're talking about mobile operators being able to monetize connectivity and services in the hands of everyday people. So that could be things like providing service where there isn't mobile coverage already. It could be where there is coverage, but it's intermittent. Or more commonly, perhaps, for people who do already have a mobile phone and existing coverage, but are willing to pay a premium to have ubiquitous geographic coverage in their country, or if they're roaming abroad. So that's sort of the consumer side.
Yeah.
The IoT side is where you're providing NTN connectivity for a range of industries that have either assets that are like off grid or in rural areas, or if they're transient. So things like automotive, logistics, agriculture, oil and gas rigs, mining pits. The list goes on where sensors or other IoT devices require connectivity, but where it's cost constraining to do that only with terrestrial. And so we're seeing a lot of satellite come in to extend that reach to reach those IoT devices. So that's the sort of high level view of the consumer and the IoT side.
Yeah, yeah. And I know on the satellite side, like satellite companies do IoT for satellite, but this integration is interesting because now it can come from like the devices that are just not specialized devices integrated into the MNO plan. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, exactly that. And it is early days. It will take time. It doesn't happen overnight, even where the standards apply to handsets in the latest specifications, because it takes people time to get a new smartphone, because the device makers have to adopt it into their designs. All of these things mean it's not going to happen overnight, but we think about this on sort of a 5 to 7 year time frame. So there's a lot to look out for in the coming years.
Yeah. So if we're in a 5 to 7 year time frame, how do you characterize where we're at right now?
So right now we're kind of transitioning from the pilot and validation stage through to the initial commercial deployments. If you look at in our latest satellite and end-to-end tracker, which we published late last week, you can check it out on our website, gsmaintelligence.com. That will show sort of the changing satellite competitive landscape, where there has been a lot of activity in terms of new constellations being launched or the start thereof. Amazon is now in play, along with Starlink and AST on the D2D side, and a lot of the legacy satellite companies are also bringing in offerings to compete in both of these IoT and consumer segments. So we're moving to that commercialization stage where the constellations will be available. The next step after that is sort of scale and adoption among the end user segments to see where we get to in terms of actual usage of the technology, which is a really important kind of sense check. And from there, you get further iteration in the competitive landscape and scale.
So a lot of MNOs are partnering with satellite players in the direct-to-device. Some of them are partnering with multiple. They might be working with like Skylo, also working with AST Space Mobile. Just last week, which when this episode comes out, it'll have been a little longer, but T-Mobile launching the T satellite like commercial service later in July. So is direct to device becoming something that is part of every MNO strategy, or is it still like niche emerging at this point?
Everyone's strategy, and everybody will have their own approach. I think what we can say though is that it's becoming the dominant type of satellite technology where an operator is partnering with a satellite, organization now to link into their network. And if you look at the early offerings, you called out T-Mobile. There are others, some of Starlink's partners in New Zealand and South America and Canada and Europe. You see different approaches to how the service is being, marketed and sold to people. In some cases, it is priced as a premium. Some cases, it's incorporated as a value add into existing plans and tariffs that people take. But I think the interesting thing to watch, this year will be sort of initial readouts from those operators that have deployed into the take up that is seen, and how that filters through into their own integration timelines on a wider scale, particularly for operators that have like pan regional footprints. So not just one country, but they actually serve customers across multiple countries, because that's where you get into, the benefits of scale effects.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been seeing, and I don't know if it's, my phone, my algorithm knows that I am reading stuff about satellite, but I've been getting a ton of Reddit ads for, I'm also a T-Mobile customer, so I've been getting a ton of ads for T satellite.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot there, and they're one of the companies that has sort of rolled out a testing program, a beta pilot program across their customers to gauge the service and customer attitudes towards it. I expect we'll see others run similar campaigns with their customer bases, to validate it while the commercial strategies are being formed. And don't forget that there is still kind of an early adopter phase playing out right now with some of the operators who have moved first. As that expands into other carriers over the course of the year and into 2026 and 2027, when more of the satellite constellations become operable, I think we'll get a more kind of clear sense for how the service is going to be marketed and what the take up is.
Yeah, I mean, so would you say each mobile network operator is going to have their own value proposition and like how they want to include it, whether they see it as like safety or it's like a big data add-on? Like, how are they making those decisions?
Exactly. It will come down to different attributes. I think if you look in the telecom industry, like for the mobile operators, the quality of your network is still the number one thing you have to stay on top of. That's what people care most about when they select a provider. And so it goes to reason that, extending your network in any way possible while maintaining, the performance to make sure it's really good is going to be something that helps you with customers. Hence a lot of the interest in satellite extending those networks. How they like what selling attributes each company uses, whether that's around coverage or reach or service access, or as you say, in the case of SOS, obviously you have Apple having sort of took the lead on that with their Global Star deal a couple of years ago. That is now, I think extending into other use cases. But I think the actual use cases people use to sort of sell the product or market the product will really, depend on their brand ethos and the individual kind of customer base they have.
Yeah, I think it will be interesting to see like who is willing to pay extra for this type of connectivity. I mean, me personally, at this point, I don't think I would pay extra for it because I'm not that often outside of a cellular network. But
Yeah.
yeah, we'll see.
We'll see, and it's interesting. Like we actually ran a survey on this last year
Okay.
across like 10 countries, and we're doing it again this year to check on that question. Like, are people aware of these services? Are they interested? Would they pay? And actually, 60% of people say they would pay more. Um, and the highest countries for that are in, low and middle income markets. So like Brazil, South Africa, India, Philippines, countries like that, where, high growth, high populous economies, but where there is still, gaps in coverage in some places. Um, whether and how much we see the willingness to pay materialize in Europe and US and other kind of advanced economies, yeah, it remains to be seen. But even a small uptick in people willing to pay for it actually has a pretty meaningful effect on the top line of the mobile operator, given the scale of the customer bases they have.
Okay. Where do you see the like state of partnerships and not necessarily availability right now, but like in countries like Brazil and the other countries that you mentioned, are there direct to device option? Like I know AST is going to be everywhere, but it depends on the partnerships with like are those MNOs taking up the partnerships to make it happen?
They are at varying paces, but yes, they are. And I think, they know their customers, they know their markets.
Yeah.
They know that this is a competitive differentiator with their own competitors. It will take time, as I said before, for the service to become available, at least at a mass market scale. But I think this year we're seeing a lot more kind of initial launches that will then move to full national availability. Um, I called out those countries because they kind of outperform the average in terms of the other countries that we asked. But this is a broad-based global trend. So when I talk about those 100 operators having at least one, satellite partnership, and that representing now 70% of the industry, if you look at the numbers and break those down, it's roughly evenly spread per capita across all regions. And so it's not kind of a regional niche. It is something that's global there, and a pragmatic approach.
Hmm. Yeah. This is an interesting one that I've been thinking about. Do you think there's any concern from mobile operators that satellite operators could take over their customers if they're offering the service themselves?
No, I think the industry is generally approaching it pragmatically so that they're working for a win-win, which is that the satellite extends the network and provides wholesale revenue to the satellite companies and retail revenue for the operators who continue to own the majority of the customer relationships. You have to bear in mind that even with large scale constellations like Starlink, there are fundamental constraints due to the laws of physics and other sort of reasons around spectrum and regulation, which sort of limit the ultimate size that can become. And indeed, the satellite organizations, particularly those offering D2D, really want to work as partners with the operators for their service, and so it's seen as kind of a more of a symbiotic relationship, again, that's why it comes down to sort of a pragmatic approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I lines up with what I'm seeing on the satellite side. So I saw that you were GSMA, you guys were at the hosted the Mobile World Congress in Shanghai recently, and you had a satellite NTN summit. What were some of your takeaways from that event last week?
It's interesting because when you go to China, it's a hyper advanced tech country. It's obviously big, and anything you see there is kind of a useful guide to what you might see in the future, or in some other variation of that in other countries. I think what we took away is that, China sees satellite as a strategically important national asset, number one. I think two, that you're seeing a move to incorporate it with other connectivity sources from the sky, this notion of a low altitude economy, where you're not just talking about low Earth orbit satellites, or satellites at higher orbit, but you're talking about drones, you're talking about these things called high altitude platform stations. You're talking about other ways of servicing connectivity from the sky that help countries with their GDP growth. So I think that was there. And I think finally you're seeing the fact that, you know, there is this, it's important not to forget about the IoT dimension. As much as we talk about everyday people using, their mobile phones and having ubiquitous coverage, potentially enabled through this integration with terrestrial and non-terrestrial, the IoT dimension is really key because a lot of the global economy is becoming more transient by its nature. And so having things in there for roaming and potentially cross-border roaming, there's still a lot of work to do, but that's an important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and that IoT, that was one of the things I had wanted to ask about. So, what is the size of that opportunity for IoT devices look like in terms of like where are things now and what is the size of opportunity for connecting like I, I don't want to say everything, but all of these devices that are out in the
Yeah.
world.
So if you look at the whole universe of what people call IoT, our estimates are that will reach about 38 billion things or devices by 2030. Now, how much of that is addressable for satellite? We think about 2.5 or 3 billion, that's sort of something in that range. Um, so a not insignificant share, and I think we see pretty common demand indicators and sentiment across different industries. Um, from a revenue perspective, we think the IoT side for satellite is from an addressable revenue perspective could reach $10 billion per year by 2035. And when you look at that as, again, just to put that in context, that's about a quarter of today's, what we think are today's IoT connectivity revenues in total.
Okay.
So again, kind of a meaningful boost there, but largely dependent on the sort of the take up and how that goes in the coming couple of years.
Yeah. In terms of demand indicators that you're seeing, what types of industries and use cases do you think would benefit the most from having that satellite IoT component?
I mean, it's not just one industry, there's a lot, but when we look at it, I think the automotive industry is certainly up there, using it for infotainment, for inbuilt navigation and other telematics. Same with trucking and logistics. We're increasingly seeing it used for businesses that have assets in remote places. So I called out heavy industry like oil and gas and mining before. We also see it for the utilities industry, things like powering weather monitors, sensors in rural parts of Africa or South America. We see it in precision agriculture where, for example, you could operate a drone that's covering salinity tests or site surveying in an area with, that's hard to reach and that can use the end-to-end connectivity to reach that. So we publish our forecasts in our global trends report, our addressable forecasts, which came out in early March. So if people want to check it out, they can get into more detail there. But that gives you kind of a high level snapshot, I guess, across the
Yeah.
different industries.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I wanted to ask about backhaul also. So that's, satellite has been servicing cellular backhaul for a long time. Are you seeing any like changes or different changes in level of interest from mobile operators to work with satellite in that way?
We have in the last 2 or 3 years. It's basically down to kind of a lower cost structure that the satellite groups are able to offer. Um, I think there's still a sort of question around the bandwidth of that backhaul in some cases, but it, the operators and any other infrastructure communication infrastructure company will look at the comparison between the options. And those tend to split between, fiber technology or Ethernet technology or microwave. These are all different options or satellite. And usually most operators will have a mix of those. And the choice is determined by how far the backhaul link has to travel and what the cost of data transfer is over that link. And so where you're talking in remote areas, it tends to be quite expensive to use some of the technologies I talked about before, microwave and so forth. And that's where satellite comes into play. And so as more businesses have assets in those remote areas and people are connected in remote areas, the backhaul benefit is there.
Yeah. And what about with low Earth orbit constellations? Is that changing the conversation in backhaul?
Not as much as in D to D, because just purely because the bandwidth allocations for backhaul haven't changed as much. The low Earth orbit is more, that's the sort of that's the main orbit level that is being used for D to D service. So that's really where it's got its biggest effect.
Yeah. Okay. And then what are you watching this year in terms of the satellite mobile integration? Doesn't have to be just D to D, just what are you watching for this year?
So I think we're watching for indicators of progress and take up. Number one, how much is the service, how much of these, 100 partnerships reach commercial service, and then what indicators do we get around people or businesses using the service? I think secondly, we'll be interested to follow the IoT space in particular, given how many industries are in play. Um, I think in terms of the satellite competition dynamics, there's always a question in terms of potential consolidation over time. I think that's likely over time. Whether that happens this year or further afield, of course, remains to be seen. But I think there's a watching brief around how many constellations are supported and at what orbit. Um, so I think those are some of the main things. And then, I think just in general, the device side of it would be the last part that we're watching, which is to say how quickly and over how many devices do OEM manufacturers incorporate NTN for. And the reason we'll watch that is A, it's a sort of key prerequisite for any of this happening, and B, um, it will be interesting to see as to whether those device makers themselves see NTN connectivity as a competitive selling point, just in the way that devices might have seen gaming or streaming or battery life or camera technology as selling points in the past.
So it's really about how many chips come out that are NTN compatible and what the uptake on getting those chips into devices is.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. And if you are Samsung or if you're Xiaomi or whatever device maker you choose, what share of your portfolio are you enabling with NTN? Because that ultimately will flow through into the hands of people who own those devices eventually.
Yeah, yeah. Are there what other types of enablement needs to happen, like other than the chip? Is there like software providers that are orchestrating the billing between terrestrial and satellite?
Definitely, and that's a sort of good question, but often a forgotten question.
Yeah,
The systems integration, the billing, the energy and power dimension, there is a number of both the equipment vendors and specialists in between play in that part of the value chain. Um, and I think right now a lot of the conversation is focused on making sure that the technology is in place so that end users, be they people or businesses, have a seamless handover between terrestrial and non-terrestrial. Because at the end of the day, people don't care about technology. They just care about something working. And so what the mobile operators are working on with their partners is to make sure that that happens as in a seamless way.
yeah, just like you said, people don't care whether it's coming from a satellite, a cellular network. They don't want to know and they don't want to be involved in making that switch off.
Exactly right. Exactly.
I'm curious if there's any like partnerships between mobile operators and satellite players that have been particularly interesting to you.
Um, we don't really zoom in on individual partnerships
Yeah.
more than the what they tell us about the general direction of travel. So whether it's, and I think the general direction of travel is that this is a pragmatic approach to extending connectivity. To it is a competitive differentiator or an emerging one because the network quality continues to be number one purchasing criteria. Um, and three, I think there's just a general interest in the monetization capabilities that a more, higher reach network, carries. Um, we're going to see different approaches from different companies, and whether that's in terms of the technology that's used or whether the marketing and commercial strategy. I think there's just going to be a lot of variation there. It's more the meta themes that we're interested in.
Yeah, yeah. In terms of the marketing, just two things that made me think of. In the US this year, Verizon had a direct to device commercial with Buzz Aldrin that was during the Grammys. And I was watching the Grammys and I was like, wow, I write about that. And then T-Mobile had theirs during the Super Bowl. So for me, it was very cool to see satellite be on such a massive stage in an advertising sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think both of those companies you mentioned have been leaders in this space and have been at the forefront, among others, of trying to incorporate the capability to serve, you know, better serve their own customers. Um, it'll be interesting to see whether and how much we see that type of activity in Europe. Um, you know, I think, you know, time will tell. Time will tell. But it is a lot of the investments being made into the constellations are high investments, and so you want to make sure that you've got a good message to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any thoughts on what satellite operators should be doing to work better with the mobile industry?
Um, so I think there's always a focus on making sure that the costs are as efficient as they can be. I think there is, you know, always a focus as well on time to market and having constellations be available eventually 24/7. Right now, a lot of the constellations that are launching don't provide service all day, every day, because there just aren't enough satellites in the sky for that. So that will take time. I think the other thing that is for operators that are working to repurpose their spectrum with satellite groups. So this is how like Starlink and AST and Link work. There's a really important focus on ensuring that there's no unintended consequences like interference or any other kind of concerns within that. And there's a lot of importance being placed on monitoring that and ensuring that doesn't happen. So those would be, I think, the main things I'd call out.
Yeah, I think we didn't talk too much about the regulatory side, but like you said, the interference is a really big issue, and how different governments are going to decide to allow that type of spectrum sharing between terrestrial and NTN. So.
Exactly, and that is down to yeah individual regulators and their national authorities.
Awesome. Well, it's been great to have you on. Do you have any last thoughts about the satellite mobile integration and what you're watching in 2025?
Just for no, as you say, it's been a good conversation. I think there's a lot more to come. We'll be watching the momentum and the extent to that's turned into actual numbers is something we're going to be following amongst other parts of the device and satellite side. So yeah, thanks for having me on, and I'm sure we'll have probably a lot to talk about in even a few months' time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, things are moving quickly, and just a couple years ago, we weren't talking about this at all. So it's been really
No,
cool to see how this has developed.
absolutely. And yeah, we will see where it goes.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex.